Analog horror. It's emerged as a unique subgenre of found footage horror, known for mimicking the eerie aesthetics of old VHS tapes and public broadcast snippets. Classic series like Local 58 and the Mandela Catalogue set the stage for subtle, slow-burning dread, rather than explicit gore. But in 2022, a YouTube creator named UrbanSPOOK, also known as Urban Slug, introduced a very different kind of analog horror series, The Painter. This series would soon become infamous in the analog horror community for its gruesome content, controversial reception, and heated debates it has sparked about the genre's direction. In this video, we'll explore what The Painter is, what happens in it, the impacts it's had on analog horror, how people perceive it, fan theory surrounding its story, and even whether it ties into a larger horror universe. We'll also compare it to other analog horror classics to see where it stands. By the end, you'll understand why The Painter has gone down in analog horror history, for better or for worse, and whether its notoriety is deserved. The Painter is an analog horror web series created by Swedish-born artist UrbanSPOOK, also goes by Urban Slug online. The series, officially titled The Painter, though many people call it UrbanSPOOK after the channel's name, premiered on YouTube on November 3rd, 2022, and over the next 2 years, UrbanSPOOK released a total of 9 episodes before concluding the story on Halloween 2024. Each episode is presented as if it were a VHS tape or archival footage, a hallmark of analog horror series, supposedly found by the uploader in the basement of an apartment complex. In-universe, these tapes contain police recordings and emergency dispatch calls documenting a series of bizarre and gruesome murders. The only clue tying these murders together, and giving the series its name, is that at each crime scene the killer leaves behind a disturbing painting of the victim, depicting the crime or the victim's final moments in a grotesque artistic detail. Unlike many analog horrors that deal with more supernatural entities or cosmic horror stuff, The Painter is grounded more in human evil. It follows what we eventually learn is a pair of very human serial killers, not ghosts or demons or entities from a different dimension, just humans. UrbanSPOOK himself is a trained artist, and all the artwork seen in the videos is all of his own creation. In fact, the series doubles as basically a showcase for his distinctive, if horrifying, art style. Something even haters of the series usually say is a strong point of it. The visuals combine gritty crime scene photography and surreal illustrations of the victims, giving the videos a uniquely macabre aesthetic. Each episode typically features a new murder case, a new painting, and fragments of police investigations or 911 calls, gradually building a narrative of the hunt for the painter killer. Stylistically, UrbanSPOOK intentionally emulates the look and feel of old police video cassettes and public service announcements. Expect to see time-stamped camcorder footage, distorted audio, glitchy visuals, and on-screen text in the manner of police reports or emergency bulletins. All of the analog hallmarks that sell the illusion of found footage. But while the format says found footage analog tape, the content often veers into outright slasher territory. In interviews and posts, the creator cited inspiration from 1980 slasher films and 2000s torture porn horror, and as we'll see, The Painter doesn't pull its punches when it comes to gore and shock value, which is a major reason it stands out and why it stirred so much discussion. The overarching story of The Painter centers on an ever-escalating murder spree and the authorities' desperate attempt to catch the perpetrators. What starts as a mysterious killer leaving creepy portraits soon evolves into this kind of cat and mouse game with law enforcement, culminating in quite a dramatic finale. Here's a bit of a breakdown of what happens throughout the series, without kind of spoiling every detail. In the first episode, Faces, viewers are introduced to the case through a montage of several strange murder scenes. We hear chilling 911 calls and see snippets of crime scene reports, establishing that a serial killer is on the loose. Crucially, police find paintings at each scene, eerie, surreal portraits of the victims painted post-mortem, so after they died. The tone is immediately unsettling and mysterious. Each subsequent episode documents another incident. For example, the episode The Lighthouse involves an old lighthouse connected to multiple murders, and In the Walls delves into the disappearance and quite grim fate of 2 children, adding to the series' complexity. Through these, a pattern emerges. Each video pairs gruesome crime evidence with one of the painter's signature artworks. As the series progresses, the killings grow more elaborate and grotesque, often seemingly designed to outdo the last in shock value. UrbanSPOOK does not shy away from disturbing content. In fact, some episodes almost dare the viewer to keep watching. One notorious example comes mid-series in an episode aptly titled Pigs. Investigators discover that the killer has disemboweled a pig and hidden a victim's corpse inside the animal. In the same case, a horse is found dead after being force-fed an overdose of sildenafil, which is another name for Viagra. Pretty darkly absurd and horrific method of murder. These scenes are presented in the matter-of-fact style of police documentation, which somehow makes them even more jarring. The accompanying painting, reportedly titled Breeding Mount May, as a kind of morbid pun, leaves little to the imagination, underscoring the killer's twisted sense of humor. Another episode features an entire family brutally murdered, including children. The painting left behind portrays a family portrait from hell, solidifying that nothing is off limits. In perhaps the most controversial episode, a young boy named Corey is killed in an especially vile manner. The painting left at the scene was bluntly titled Fuck Toy Corey, implying pretty unspeakable abuse. That particular detail caused an uproar, but more on that later. Through each installment, the viewer is pulled deeper into this nightmare investigation, wondering who could commit such atrocities and why. Alongside the shocks, the painter does sprinkle clues about the culprit. The videos are not just random horror vignettes. There is a through line if you kind of pay attention. We learn that one potential victim, a police officer named Bill Collins, has gone missing under suspicious circumstances. For a while, Bill is presumed another casualty of the painter, but eagle-eyed viewers noticed odd details. For instance, in the 4th episode, a photograph briefly shows an unknown figure believed to be the killer, and intriguingly, a man's severed arm is found encased in wax at a crime scene. That arm is identified as belonging to Officer Bill Collins, suggesting Bill probably met some kind of gruesome fate. However, some fans theorize on an alternate possibility. Could Bill have faked his death and actually be behind the murders? This speculation ran rampant in the comment sections and multiple forums as the series went on. Another reoccurring character is Tina Rosenberg, who appears in multiple tapes and seems to be either a lead investigator or maybe the one compiling these tapes. Her presence is one of the few constants in a story where most characters don't tend to live past one episode. UrbanSPOOK saved the resolution for the 9th and final episode, titled Hell, released on October 31st, 2024. This finale finally shows the confrontation between police and the elusive painter. In a tense sequence captured via a responding officer's body camera footage, the killer, revealed to be not one, but 2 people, is cornered at the scene of their latest crime. It turns out the murderous artist was a duo all along, Mona Lanius, a disturbed young woman, and Bill Collins, the very cop who had been missing and who cleverly threw investigators off by planting his own severed arm as false evidence. This twisted Bonnie and Clyde pair had been collaborating in the murders. Officer Nathan Cole identifies them just as a violent struggle ensues. Bill is killed during the confrontation, poetic justice, one might say, as he falls by the same violence he dealt out. I'd assume the one arm probably didn't help. While Mona Lanius is captured alive and finally taken into custody. The reign of the painters, as they are fittingly pluralized, is over. The series closes with a sense of grim relief and a final haunting painting to drive home the horror one last time. It's worth noting that this conclusion was relatively straightforward, no last-minute supernatural twist, no ambiguous cliffhanger. In fact, some viewers commented that the final video actually does a lot of what most YouTubers criticize his previous videos for lacking, such as giving a more coherent story payoff. By ending the saga with the killers unmasked and justice, more or less, served, UrbanSPOOK wrapped up the painter in a definitive way. However, as we'll discuss, the road to that finale was a bumpy one, marked by fan excitement, fatigue, and plenty of controversy. While the plot of The Painter follows a crime thriller trajectory, its presentation is firmly rooted in analog horror conventions. This mix of styles made it both unique and divisive. Let's break down the elements at play. UrbanSPOOK nails the look and feel of vintage footage. Videos come complete with VHS tracking lines, degraded audio, and period-appropriate graphics. Several episodes pose as things like public service announcements, or PSAs, public training videos gone horribly wrong, or police training videos gone horribly wrong. For instance, an episode might start with what looks like a routine educational film, or a televised emergency alert, only to have the signal hijacked by disturbing content, a classic analog horror trick. In The Painter, those interruptions reveal 911 call audio, or slides of crime scene evidence, etc., all delivered with deadpan seriousness. This technique of mixing the mundane with the horrific is another staple of analog horror, meant to unsettle viewers by corrupting familiar media formats. UrbanSPOOK uses it to ground the outrageous crimes in a veneer of realism. Many fans praised how well he replicated the retro vibe, saying it emulates the look of analog media in the late 20th century authentically. If nothing else, the technical execution, from the grainy visuals to the droning synth background music, succeeds in immersing you in a creepy, bygone era. The centerpiece of each episode is the painting of the victim. These images, illustrated by UrbanSPOOK himself, are nightmarish and surreal, often incorporating elements of the murder method or the victim's agony in abstract ways. For example, the painting for the Pigs episode reportedly showed grotesque swine imagery, to say the least, entangled with the human victim, a visual pun on that pretty insane crime. The artwork's quality is generally high. UrbanSPOOK is clearly a skilled digital painter, and even many critics of the series agree that the art is the best part of the series, even though it's a little bit horrifying. Some viewers were drawn in initially by the striking thumbnail images alone. UrbanSPOOK has veered away completely from AI-generated art, insisting on doing everything by hand for authenticity. This gives the painter a distinctive identity in a genre where some creators rely on stock images or AI for creature design. The paintings are so central that the series essentially functions as a morbid art gallery woven into a narrative. It's no coincidence that UrbanSPOOK sold merch featuring some paintings, a decision that kind of backfired when one such painting was seen as going too far. Unlike traditional analog horror that prioritizes implication over explicit gore, the painter kind of gleefully dives into explicit content. It repackages the slasher/torture porn film ethos into analog format. In doing so, it challenged the unwritten rules of analog horror. Typically, analog horror relies on subtle dread, liminal spaces, and unseen threats. Think of the eerie ambiguity of something like Local 58, or the more cosmic horror hints in Gemini Home Entertainment. The painter instead puts the horror front and center. Mutilated bodies, graphic descriptions of torture, and absolutely outrageous crimes that would make a seasoned horror movie fan wince. It's as if Saw or August Underground, the notorious 2000s fake snuff film series, collided with a creepypasta VHS tape. This approach did get the painter a lot of attention. Some viewers were morbidly fascinated by the sheer audacity of the kills, while others felt it betrayed the spirit of analog horror by relying on gross outs over atmosphere. Love it or hate it, the series' shock factor became its defining trait. Another common critique of the painter's storytelling is that it feels formulaic and a little bit disjointed. Each episode tends to stand alone as a dossier of murder, with only thin connective tissue until the final chapters. Many episodes introduce a set of characters, usually the soon-to-be victims, perhaps a cop or a witness, only for them to meet a grisly end by the episode's conclusion, often without much character development. This is intentional to some degree. It's a crime anthology structure, but it means the series leans heavily on shock value to hold interest rather than on deepening plots or characters. As one wiki summary put it, the painter has very few recurring characters and most victims exist just to be killed off, so there's little emotional weight when they die. Exposition is delivered via on-screen text or narration rather than character interactions, which can feel a little bit tell not show at times. Some fans enjoyed the procedural, almost documentary-like style. Some people found it to be an interesting blend of, say, police thriller and horror, but a lot of others agreed with the sentiment that nothing actually happens in The Painter. There is no real plot to speak of, beyond the shock gimmick. We'll dig more into those criticisms in the next section. In short, the painter plays like an experiment in pushing analog horror's boundaries. It melds the genre's retro presentation with a grindhouse gorefest narrative. This won it a fair share of admirers who wanted something different and more visceral, but also set the stage for significant backlash as the series gained notoriety. When the painter first hit YouTube, it quickly intrigued a lot of horror fans. Early episodes garnered a positive response, or at least a morbid curiosity. For example, the debut episode, Faces, received tens of thousands of likes, 32,000 plus versus 1.9 thousand dislikes at one point, and many comments praising the fresh idea of a serial killer themed analog horror. Viewers were unnerved and captivated by the concept of a killer who paints victims, and many remarked on the quality of UrbanSPOOK's artwork and the creepy realism of the presentation. At first, it seemed UrbanSPOOK had a hit series on his hands within the analog horror community. However, as new episodes rolled out, cracks began to show. A growing segment of the audience started to criticize the series for being too repetitive and shallow beneath the shock surface. The formula was clear. Each video delivered an over-the-top murder scenario, but offered little else in terms of story progression or thematic depth. Some horror YouTubers and commenters pointed out that after the initial novelty, the painter wasn't evolving its horror, it was just making each kill more grotesque than the last. It's a classic case of escalation for shock's sake. One commenter argued that the series relied entirely on shock value to carry its horror, always trying to describe the most vile thing possible with little else to offer. That quote comes from a YouTuber named Pastra, a well-established horror analyst who would kind of become a central figure in the public controversy around this series. The simmering criticism kind of boiled over on October 1st, 2023, when Pastra posted a now infamous critique of the series on Twitter. In his tweet, Pastra urged the horror community to stop praising series that rely entirely on shock value to carry their horror, explicitly calling out UrbanSPOOK's work. Stuff like UrbanSPOOK drives me nuts because the only horror it has relies entirely on trying to describe the most vile thing possible with little else. This pretty blunt assessment struck a chord with many who were frustrated with the Painter series. It essentially labeled the series as a cheap thrill with no substance, a far cry from the nuanced dread of some other analog horror greats. Coming from Pastra, who is known for his pretty balanced reviews, this criticism had a lot of weight to it, and so it spread quite quickly through the horror fan circles. Unfortunately, UrbanSPOOK did not take the criticism very gracefully. Instead of quietly reflecting or responding diplomatically, he fired back on Twitter with an angry, defensive rant, in a reply that was soon deleted, but of course, it's the internet, so screenshots spread like wildfire. UrbanSPOOK lashed out at Pastra with insults and, unfortunately, slurs. A pretty derogatory phrasing. This meltdown shocked basically everyone. It's one thing for a creator to disagree with a critique, but UrbanSPOOK's response was seen as extremely unprofessional and quite offensive, attacking Pastra personally rather than addressing the content of the critique itself. Essentially, UrbanSPOOK doubled down that extreme horror has a place and insulted anyone who didn't like his style. The backlash to this, as you can probably imagine, was immediate and quite fierce. By openly insulting a respected community member and using a slur mocking neurodivergence no less, UrbanSPOOK had, in many fans' eyes, shot himself in the foot. The situation blew up beyond just analog horror Twitter. Other creators weighed in, nearly unanimously condemning UrbanSPOOK's behavior. In a remarkable moment, even the official account of the Ches Kids Archive, another popular analog horror series, broke its usual in-character posting to tell UrbanSPOOK to, quote, go fuck himself. It was as if the analog horror community at large was saying, we do not condone this. UrbanSPOOK eventually deleted his rant due to the backlash, but by then the damage was done and screenshots ensured his words wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. What followed was a wave of negative spotlight on the Painter. Fans and critics started scrutinizing the series more and more harshly, and hate watching became more common. Numerous YouTube videos and streams appeared dissecting the Painter and the drama, some titled things like the worst analog horror series I've ever watched. By early 2024, it was almost trendy to dunk on the Painter as the genre's nadir, the lowest point of analog horror. The series' reputation in many circles tanked practically overnight. Where it had once had an air of promising creativity, it was now being cited as an example of what not to do in horror storytelling. It wasn't just the attitude of the creator that people took issue with. The scrutiny also brought to light some content decisions in The Painter that many found deeply problematic. Beyond just being gory, the aforementioned case of Fuck Toy Corey, a child victim implied to have been sexually abused and murdered, is one. Viewers argued the topic of child sexual abuse was handled in a exploitative, edgelord kind of way with no real sensitivity or narrative purpose. Matters were only made worse when it was discovered that UrbanSPOOK had actually sold merchandise, t-shirts, featuring this painting. This crossed the line for a lot of people. It felt like profiting off an image of a violated child, albeit a fictional one, purely for shock. The backlash to this was pretty intense and actually caused UrbanSPOOK to quietly pull the item and issue an apology. In general, critics said the painter mishandled sensitive topics, be it child abuse, rape, or animal cruelty, using them as cheap horror fodder without meaningful commentary or emotional weight. In analog horror, and horror in general, there's an understanding that with especially traumatic subjects, you should usually tread carefully. UrbanSPOOK's approach was seen as juvenile shock jockeying instead of a more thoughtful horror. To UrbanSPOOK's credit, he did eventually show some remorse. He apologized for his outburst at Pastra and for any of his ableist remarks. He also addressed, on Reddit apparently, the rumor that he was making the series just to sell shirts, denying it and expressing that he was truly trying to tell a horror story. But by this point, the court of public opinion had pretty much all but turned against him. Even if an apology might have mended some fences, the series itself still had to prove it could be more than just torture porn masquerading as analog horror. Amidst the controversy, UrbanSPOOK quietly continued working on the finale of The Painter. When the final episode, Hell, dropped on Halloween 2024, some viewers were actually surprised by its quality. It was evident that UrbanSPOOK took some criticisms to heart. The finale had improved production values, a more coherent narrative, as we summarized earlier, the ending actually tied up the mystery, and a bit more restraint in how the story was delivered. One YouTube commenter wrote, "This is by far the best video on this channel," noting that the finale succeeded in areas previous episodes fell short. Another praised it as utterly effing fantastic compared to previous episodes. Even some skeptics conceded that if earlier episodes had been more like the last, the series might have avoided a lot of the criticism it got. The final confrontation with the killers and the way it was executed, for example a scene of the victim still screaming in the background as the end's text appears, genuinely creeped out some viewers, a sign that when it wanted to, the series could deliver effective horror just beyond grossing us out. However, a single good episode couldn't completely rehabilitate the painter's tarnished reputation. Many in the community had already written it off. The finale did attract a lot of viewers. Controversy does fuel curiosity after all, and the comment sections were full of debate, some saying maybe UrbanSPOOK redeemed himself here, others pretty unmoved and reminding everyone of the earlier missteps. A media article later observed that while the Halloween 2024 episode was praised by some for greatly improving the series' quality, it ultimately failed to fully rehabilitate its reputation. In other words, The Painter ended on a relatively high note, but for many, it remained a pretty notorious example of an analog horror gone very wrong. In the end, UrbanSPOOK's The Painter became one of the most talked about analog horrors, albeit not entirely for the reasons he might have hoped. It sparked important conversations in the horror community about shock value versus substance, about how creators should handle criticism, and about the boundaries of good taste. As one Redditor by the name of Hobby Drama concluded, either way, The Painter has gone down in analog horror history for better or for worse. There's truth to that. Love it, hate it, or love to hate it. Horror fans won't be forgetting this series anytime soon. Despite, or because of, its infamy, The Painter has inspired plenty of fan discussion and theories. Let's delve into a few interesting angles the community has explored, from story theories to connections with a wider analog horror universe. Early on, some viewers wondered if there was going to be a supernatural reveal. The crimes depicted were so extreme and bizarre that a few fans theorized no ordinary person could be responsible for this. Could the painter actually be a demon or some paranormal entity manifesting through art? However, clues in the story, and the down-to-earth kind of tone, pointed to a human culprit. There was a Reddit discussion titled "The Painter, Human or Monster?" had fans debating this. The consensus, even before the finale, was that the killer was just a twisted human, possibly a very drugged up human, driven by a deranged hobby, as one user remarked. Indeed, the final reveal confirmed the antagonists are two flesh and blood people, not a ghost, a goblin, or a creature. In a way, this makes the horror a little more unsettling. It reminds us real humans can absolutely be monsters in behavior. So while the painter doesn't connect to any paranormal lore, it does tap into the age-old horror tropes of humans being the scariest monsters of all. Another area of theory crafting was why the painters do what they do. The series itself doesn't spell out the killer's backstory or motives explicitly, leaving that to viewer imagination. Fans speculated various possibilities. One interesting theory posited that Mona Lanius, the female killer, had the delusional goal of creating a perfect family through her crimes. In this theory, the victims in certain episodes symbolically represented family roles she was collecting. For instance, one victim is a father figure, another a mother, perhaps referencing an episode where a 911 dispatcher, often called a lifeline, was killed. Maybe a stretch, but fans of anything love to draw conclusions. The gruesome family episode, where an entire family is murdered, is thought to tie into Mona's obsession with family. Could it be that Mona and Bill saw themselves as artists releasing people from imperfect lives and immortalizing them as art? It's a pretty twisted idea, but given the series' psychological darkness, not impossible. Other theories are more straightforward. Maybe the killers were just sadistic and liked the notoriety, painting their victims as a signature to taunt the police, not unlike real-life serial killers who send letters or keepsakes or what have you. The lack of a confirmed motive in canon means viewers are free to project their own interpretations, and in horror, sometimes the lack of motive, they kill because they enjoy it kind of thing, is meant to be the scariest explanation of all. When fans talked about a larger universe, they're often thinking in terms of crossovers or shared lore. Painter largely stands on its own. It isn't officially connected to any other analog horror stories. However, the idea of it being part of a bigger world is a fun talking point. For example, some fans imagined what if the Painter's events were happening in the same universe as a series like Gemini Home Entertainment or The Walton Files. The thought is intriguing, a world where not only are there cosmic aliens or haunted animatronics from, those other series, but also a pair of human serial killers running around making twisted art. There's no evidence for this at all in the videos themselves, but fans love to create crossover theories in a very creepypasta / analog horror extended universe kind of way. On a more concrete level, the Painter did indirectly intersect with other series via the Controversy. For example, the Ches Kids archive account breaking character to address UrbanSPOOK was a meta crossing of worlds, albeit on Twitter rather than in story. That moment was pretty striking. One analog horror entity, Ches Kids' fictional archive persona, essentially entered the real world drama of another series. It showed how interconnected the creator community is. If we stretch, one could joke that all analog horror exists in a multiverse of sorts, where creators, as characters, occasionally collab in weird ways like this, like an analog horror Fortnite. Fans on Reddit even dug into pinpointing the setting of the Painter. Clues like telephone area code 985 mentioned in one video, and the use of police body cam technology helped determine that the story likely takes place in Louisiana around 2005-2007. The area code 985 was created in 2001 for southern Louisiana, and body cameras became common after about 2005. So these little details imply a post-2001 timeframe. One fan speculated the town might be Houma in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. I definitely pronounced that wrong. Which, if true, means the Painter lurked in the Bayou country. This level of detail shows that despite its outlandish gore, UrbanSPOOK tried to root the series in a plausible reality. Knowing that time and place can also enhance appreciation, the mid-2000s setting explains the analog tech. VHS tapes were still around, though on their way out, and the Deep South locale adds an extra layer of gritty southern gothic vibe to the crimes. But did the Painter hide any nods to other analog horrors or inspirations? There's nothing overt, but genre-savvy viewers caught some parallels. For instance, a portion in one episode mimics a public access TV safety announcement format, a nod to Local 58's famous contingency and weather service episodes, which also use emergency broadcast styles. The difference is, instead of cosmic moon monsters or government conspiracies, the Painter's version interrupts with police alerts about gruesome killings. It's almost a bait and switch. You think it's a normal analog horror with maybe aliens or ghosts or some other kind of entity. But nope, just a human horror more akin to a true crime documentary from hell. Some have compared the painter to being the Garten of Banban of analog horror, meaning it's seen as a low-tier shock value entry in the genre, much like Garten of Banban is viewed in gaming, widely panned yet oddly talked about quite a lot. This comparison, while harsh, highlights how other analog horror series had set a bar for storytelling that the painter was failing to meet in many eyes. Conversely, admirers of the painter sometimes liken it more to an ARG or mystery. One defender on Reddit argued that the painter is more than a horror series, it's a mystery more than anything, suggesting that if you piece together the clues, for example Bill Collins' disappearance, multiple photos, etc., there is a detective puzzle to solve. This perspective invites rewatching the series with a keen eye for detail, treating it as sort of a morbid whodunit, where the viewer can figure out the culprits before the finale reveals them, and indeed, some savvy fans did predict the two-killer twist based on the hints. For instance, noticing that certain murders had to involve a physically strong person, presumably Bill, and perhaps someone with medical knowledge or feminine presentation, speculation about Mona. Such theory crafting kept the community engaged even as the content itself was divisive. In summary, while the painter might not have a formal expanded universe or crossover lore, it certainly generated a lot of engagement in the form of theories and discussions, whether debating the nature of its villain, hypothesizing motives, or comparing it to other genre works. People found plenty to talk about. In a way, that indicates the painter did succeed in capturing interest. It made people think, or at least argue, about what they had watched, which is often a goal of horror media. Finally, let's zoom out and look at the broader impact the painter had on analog horror as a genre. It's rare for a single series to noticeably affect a whole genre's discourse, but the painter did become something of a landmark, albeit a controversial one. Here's a few ways that it's left its mark. Analog horror purists often champion the idea that the genre's horror comes from subtlety, quote, the erosion of trust in once reassuring media forms, end quote, and psychological tension rather than blood and guts. The painter flew in the face of that, and the backlash to it reinforced how strongly many fans feel about analog horror's identity. The very public Pastra versus UrbanSPOOK debate essentially boiled down to what kind of horror should analog horror strive to be? Is it valid to use the analog format to deliver exploitation-style gore stories? Some argued that of course it's valid. Horror is a broad tent, and analog is just an aesthetic that can frame any kind of story. After all, VHS-era horror films certainly weren't all subtle, many were cheesy slashers. Others felt that the painter was an aberration, a lowest common denominator approach that could give the genre a bad name by associating it with cheap shock. These discussions played out across YouTube video essays, Reddit threads, and Discord chats through late 2023 and 2024. In effect, the painter made the community reflect on the unwritten rules of analog horror. It drew comparisons to earlier genre-defining works. For example, people contrasted it with the Mandela Catalogue, which has disturbing ideas and imagery, but very little gore, to highlight how horror can be effective without extreme violence. The consensus among many creators was that the painter's approach should be the exception, not the norm, in analog horror. The saga of UrbanSPOOK's public relations meltdown became an object lesson. Aspiring horror creators saw in real time how not to handle criticism. The incident is now somewhat infamous even outside of the analog niche. YouTubers cite it when talking about creators lashing out at their fans. It underscores the importance of being open to feedback, especially in a community-driven space like YouTube horror. Also, the fact that UrbanSPOOK apologized later and even improved his final episode shows that listening, eventually, can lead to better content. In the future, if another analog horror series leans heavily on edgy content, you can bet people will bring up the painter and say, be careful or you'll end up like that guy. In that sense, the painter's legacy is a bit of a warning sign on the road of analog horror evolution. On the flip side, some fans credit the painter with expanding what analog horror can be about. Before, common themes were things like haunted TV stations, creepy children's shows, cosmic entities, or some kind of paranormal intruder, often very surreal or sci-fi. The painter proved you could tell a true crime style serial killer story in this format. In doing so, it merged analog horror with the age-old genre of serial killer thrillers. Think Silence of the Lambs, Seven, told via found footage. Not everyone liked the result, but it did bring in viewers who maybe wouldn't have have watched analog horror otherwise, but were lured by the criminal horror aspect. It's possible we'll see future series that take inspiration from this blend, albeit perhaps executing it with a bit more finesse. Also, UrbanSPOOK's strong art focus, every episode having an original painting, added an artistic flair uncommon in other series, potentially inspiring creators to incorporate original artwork or illustrations into their analog storytelling in new ways. The uproar around the painter led to a lot of community bonding in a strange way. Fans rallied together either to critique it or in some cases to defend it as misunderstood. The r/analog horror subreddit saw lengthy threads picking apart painter storytelling with titles like "The concept was so promising" and others offering unpopular opinions that it wasn't that bad. This collective dissection arguably sharpens the community's critical thinking about what makes analog horror effective, similar to how film buffs might bond over discussing a polarizing movie. In the end, the painter did become a reference point, a common piece of genre lore that analog horror fans, especially those active online, are expected to know. If you're deep into analog horror, someone mentioning UrbanSPOOK series will likely spur an eye roll or a knowing sigh. It's become notorious enough to be part of the canon of conversation next to giants like Local 58 or Mandela Catalog, albeit as the black sheep of the family. Now that the series is complete and some time has passed, there's a bit of revisionism happening. A few voices in the community have said, okay, we dogpiled on it, but was it really the worst ever? It had its moments. They point to the genuinely creepy ideas in some episodes, or the impressive art and music. The series soundtrack and sound design also got praise for enhancing this unsettling atmosphere. There's recognition that it's a mixed bag. The painter is schlocky shock horror, the gore fest of analog horror, as one fan put it. I don't like all of it, but when it hits, well, it hits. That sentiment acknowledges that between the over-the-top bits, there were scenes and concepts that were effective horror. As the controversy cools, some horror aficionados even seek it out just out of curiosity. Much like people watch the notorious video nasties or banned films to judge for themselves, in this sense, the painter might actually endure as a cult object within analog horror. Infamous, but still drawing viewers, if only to see what the fuss was about. In conclusion, UrbanSPOOK's The Painter is a fascinating case study in modern horror media. It began as a creative blend of real art and analog spookiness, escalated into a gore-soaked serial killer saga, and then kind of imploded into controversy that spills across the internet. We've seen what happens in it, from pigs and Viagra to Final Justice, and we've seen how it's affected the genre, from stirring debates on quality to becoming a byword for shock-heavy content. It's a series that pushed boundaries and got burned, yet still earned a place in the pantheon of analog horror talking points. Personally, I find The Painter exemplifies both the promise and the peril of internet horror storytelling. It shows how an independent creator can captivate and repulse thousands in equal measure, and how community engagement can shape a narrative just as much as the creator does. Whether you view The Painter as a bold artistic statement, a gross-out misfire, or something in between, it undeniably made an impact. Perhaps the best way to sum it up is with a twist on that old saying, art is in the eye of the beholder. In this case, horror is in the eye of the beholder, and UrbanSPOOK gave us a gallery of horrors to behold. It's up to each viewer to decide if there's something meaningful in those paintings, or if they're just really gross splatters on a canvas. Either way, we're still talking about it, and that in itself makes The Painter a remarkable, if controversial, piece of the analog horror universe. And that about sums up our discussion today. If you'd like to see me react for the first time, blindly, to this series, then click on this video here. We react to it from start to finish in one sitting, and prior to this, I didn't even know the series existed. So I hope you enjoy all my reactions to the really messed up stuff that goes on. Thank you all so much for watching, subscribe if you want to see more, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye!